It's a great honour and a pleasure for me, at any rate, to be invited to speak at this prestigious event. I'll start off with two observations about maritime defence cooperation in this region. There's more than there used to be, but there's less than there is in Europe, as demonstrated perhaps by the search for the missing Malaysian airliner MH370 recently. Our theme this morning is how to improve things. Looking at the future, I can identify, I think, two trends, one encouraging and one not. The encouraging trend is that there is, in fact, more maritime defence cooperation developing. If one looks at the agreement over the Straits of Malacca to deal with piracy, or again, to deal with piracy off Somalia, one can see clear evidence of this. But as we've just heard, there's also plenty of evidence of dispute, tension, rising competition. This water fight in the East China Sea between various Coast Guard forces, for example, looks terrific fun, but it's terribly dangerous. So I think the notion of how to proceed has to identify two separate ways forward. To build on what is encouraging and to try and reduce what is not. And in this twofold process, therefore, there's a requirement to try and develop maritime cooperation, perhaps particularly in the area of maritime security, and secondly, to manage tensions and competition. So let me start off by looking at what you could call track one, I suppose, the notion of developing cooperation. To a large extent, I would argue, this is going to be pushing on an open door. And the reason for that is quite simple, that all the countries in this region have common interests that derive from that. And basically shipping, sea-based trade, and everything it produces is essential to the peace and prosperity of all the countries in this region, and everybody knows it. What it effectively produces is a global system which is hung together by interdependence of an economic and directly economic nature. It means that all countries in this system, which clearly operates, as you can see from that map produced by plotting the radio transmissions of ships over a period of a week, doesn't identify countries, with the exception of Australia and maybe with a bit of imagination, New Zealand. It operates the system rather than individual countries. Countries operate below this level, if you like. But it means that everybody is affected by everything that happens everywhere, good and bad. So all have a common interest in defending that system and defending the good order at sea, the maritime security, if you like, on which it depends. And so looking at maritime security and how to increase it, which is an essential for everyone, is obviously an excellent avenue for increasing the level of general maritime cooperation in the Asia-Pacific region, and perhaps, therefore, of dealing with the kind of tensions that we've just heard about. Now, we all know what the threats to the system are. There are many and various. They include things like piracy and sea robbery, the proliferation of dangerous weaponry of all sorts, terrorism, the illicit trade in narcotics, which produces both direct and indirect threats to the system, human trafficking, illegal fishing, environmental degradation, something that's often forgotten by us political scientists, so shouldn't be. And then possibly the worst threat of all, interstate conflict and disputes. The scale of this problem is increasing, and that's because of shipping trends, which are also increasing. This extraordinary version of the growth of sea trade produced by my colleague Martin Stopford back in the UK really makes very dramatically the scale of the problem that we confront since the Second World War period, more or less. The growth of sea trade is simply astronomical. And most estimates of the immediate future suggest that this trend line will continue and will have to continue for everybody's peace and prosperity. And so the scale of what has to be defended, if you like, is going to increase. And therefore, its vulnerability is going to increase because the threats will increase as well. This kind of graph simply reminds us of some of the basic points that most countries actually do not need reminding about. The importance of maritime trade, the relative rise of Asia, the need to take all threats to maritime trade extremely seriously, but also at the same time, the need to be realistic about what's achievable. So, what does maritime security and good order at sea actually require? Well, it's fairly obvious, really. It requires an awareness of the importance of the issue. It requires countries, regions, the world, to adopt a maritime policy that integrates the interests of all stakeholders. It requires some form of integrated maritime governance. And then all of this to be implemented by coast guards, navies, and other agencies of law enforcement. So how does this proceed? How does one deliver maritime security? It's quite clearly a team game. It's an obvious statement. It requires multinational and multi-agency cooperation because, as we all know, fish don't observe national boundaries, nor does pollution, nor does terrorism. All of these issues are transnational. The response to them has to be transnational. This is obvious. This is generally recognized by everybody. So delving a bit further into this, the requirements of maritime security are really twofold, it seems to me. The first one is to work on this business of how important the issue is, maritime awareness, if you like. And the second is to build up operational cooperation between nations in order to deal with it. So let me very quickly take us through some of the issues, some of the practical issues that this raises. Starting off, of course, with maritime awareness. Well, what this seems to require is first of all, the centrality of what you might call actionable intelligence. The kind of information that's processed, turned into intelligence at a time when the people who need it, where they need it, what they need, at the right time they need. The advantages of a common operational picture between those navies and coast guards operating in defence of maritime security are also pretty obvious. We know because of the scale of the problem that responses have to be intelligence-led in order for them to be cost-effective and to even begin to grasp the scale of the problem they face. So this requires information fusion centres. It requires multi-agency threat and risk assessment that needs to be done transnationally as well as nationally. And this will be the basis, if you like, hopefully, for regional maritime security plans, as one sees slowly developing in places like the Straits of Malacca, for example. But real progress here depends clearly on multinational cooperation. And we all know, and we've just heard, in fact, that there are huge problems here. Problem number one is acute competition for resources. Problem number two, very much related, unresolved disputes in places like the South and East China Seas. Problem number three is acute sensitivity, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region, to sovereignty. And this is one of the big differences, it seems to me, between the Asia-Pacific and Europe. In Europe, we're more used these days to the idea of pooling sovereignty. That's nothing like the situation that applies to here. And the reason for that is that there is still a tendency in this area to equate sovereignty with security. And this can be demonstrated, for example, by the well-known disputes there are between various countries about freedom of navigation issues that I noticed featured in our preliminary video. And also ways in which UNCLOS, the Law of the Sea Treaty, is to be implemented and applied to particular areas. These kind of difficulties lead to further problems. It leads to a reluctance to exchange information, a reluctance to change standard operational procedures in order to cooperate better with other countries, a reluctance to reveal possible weaknesses and deficiencies in one's maritime forces and their capacity to cope with challenge. It reflects national differences in the resources that are available, very possibly national differences in political outlook. And of course, one has to remember that maritime security priorities differ from one country to another. Some countries may put terrorism at the top of their list of things to worry about when it comes to looking at maritime security. Others look at illegal fishing or the human trafficking or whatever it is. And this is natural. This is a reflection of the geographic position of different countries and what they care about. So if all of those are the problems, or at least some of the problems, what are the solutions? Well, I think, again, they're fairly obvious. We all know what they are. It's how to actually implement improvement in them. The first, I think, has to be the exchange of information, transparency, if you like, about what is going on, and the processes of turning that information into useful intelligence to identify what's normal in order to be able to quickly detect what is not normal and therefore warrants looking at. There's a business of increasing operational interchange through, for example, participations in exercises, multinational exercises, the swapping of personnel from one navy to another. We saw one example of that in the previous display. All of this kind of thing increases familiarity with other people's navies and coast guards, marine police forces and so on, and aids the idea of cooperation. In some cases, in many cases actually, it may be a question of contributing to capacity building in the maritime security sector to try and level up capabilities so they can operate more effectively. Politically, I think it's quite important to get over the idea that these sorts of arrangements should be non-negotiable. They're not, if you like, concessions that can be withdrawn if relations between countries deteriorate at any particular moment. They're simply in the interest of everybody. They should be the last thing that people stop doing and stop talking to each other about, because it's a common interest to develop maritime security. But having said all this, it's quite clear that this is a long and rocky road, and what we're going to need is what I tend to call the 3 Ps: patience, practice, perseverance. After all, the European Union over the past 50 years has been working at this. It has achieved a great deal, but it's still perfectly well aware that there are lots of residual problems that still need to be addressed. This is a difficult area. We shouldn't expect decisive victories and decisive breakthroughs in the development of maritime cooperation. It's going to be a long, hard slog. It's dependent, though, of course, on that second track that I briefly mentioned, which is reducing tensions and competition of the sort we've just been hearing about. This is in parallel. We can't do one without the other. We need to do both simultaneously. And quite clearly, the fundamental purpose of navies is to defend their nations and their national interests. And quite clearly, whether they admit it or not, developing the capacity to fight the wars they seek to deter is their principal task. And in order to do that, they develop obvious functions. The capacity to deter, both conventionally and in some cases nuclearly. The capacity to maintain sea control, to attack and protect shipping, as the case may be, to defend their territory, and sometimes their maritime territory as well, and maybe ballistic missile defense as well. And then, of course, amphibious operations. And what we've seen, of course, is a substantial program of naval modernization in the Asia-Pacific region. And this, coupled with rising tensions in the East and South China Sea, gives an unwelcome impression of developing competition. It could even produce an arms race, a destabilizing arms race that makes the situation worse than it was before, takes control of events away from politicians and into inanimate forces like naval development. And the awful example that's always quoted at this time is the Anglo-German naval arms race of 1909-1912, just before the First World War. And it's worth looking at this, I think, a little while. The characteristics of a naval arms race. I think there are 6 of them. First, that it's basically internationally driven. It's aimed against somebody, if you like. It's usually pretty bilateral, with 2 sides to the case, associated with abnormal intensity in naval development of some form or another, high levels of political tension, tends to be quite specifically focused operation. It is aimed against somebody in a specific area. And there are also very high stakes. So if those are the characteristics of what has happened in the past, should we not take these as a guidance of a set of things to look at in order to try and reduce levels of competition? So if one goes through them in that order, clearly there are other incentives that are behind naval modernization. Domestic incentives about developing the maritime and industrial economy, or satisfying the desires of an important constituency of interest within your country that are not necessarily aimed internationally. Bilaterally, of course, some are unavoidable, particularly in the Korean Peninsula. And maybe the warnings of history, if you like, are to try and avoid bilateral formations in the international architecture of the Asia-Pacific region, like, for example, a China against the rest situation, which many people would argue to be highly dangerous. Intensity, well, is it? We've heard that spending levels have hugely increased in this area. But mostly, countries spend rather less than 2% of their GDP on defence. So if you look at it from the point of view of effort rather than money spent, it seems to be a manageable sort of situation. But what is worrying is a lack of transparency. Because there's a lack of transparency, there is a tendency to assume the worst case about the intentions of naval development in other countries. The situation here is improving, but slowly, and perhaps it would help if it was improved a bit faster. As far as political tensions are concerned, obviously we need to focus on methods of de-escalating those incidents when they occur, incidents at sea agreement. Those sorts of approaches reduce levels of tension when they happen. It's obviously very specific. The Eastern China Sea, as we've seen, is an geographically unavoidable major focus of concern for all of the players in the area. The same bits of sea, if you like, are China's access to the open ocean, Japan's defense line, China's A2AD sea denial capabilities, American air-sea battle. I mean, these sorts of things are inevitable. But possibly one should also emphasize the point that day-to-day activity of most of the navies in this region is not that. It is, in fact, the business of doing things like engaging in counter-piracy operations elsewhere. It's not that specific. Quite different from what it was in Europe before the First World War. And on the matter of high stakes, for example, islands, boundaries are clearly important and getting more so for countries sensitive about their sovereignty. But peace and prosperity is the highest stake of all, and we all need reminding of that, possibly. So, finally, my sort of suggested response, such as it is, I think it's really a question of managing expectations, not to overreact to what's happening, to assume perhaps rather more relaxed that the kind of naval development that we're seeing is, in a sense, predictable, not necessarily frightening. The key difference between the situation here and the situation in Europe before the First World War was that before the First World War, politicians spoke of the arms race as something that justified naval spending. So far, this doesn't happen here. So that's, it seems to me, a hopeful sign. One can also argue, in fact, that the 1909-1912 naval arms race between Germany and Britain was actually not that dangerous. It didn't actually produce war. It stopped 2 years before the war, in effect. Nor did the arms race between Britain and France in the 19th century produce war. In fact, you can make the mischievous argument that maybe not engaging in this kind of competitive behaviour in naval modernisation, as the Western Allies did in the 1930s, that's more dangerous than engaging in it. At least it's something to think about. Even so, the real warnings of the past should be taken seriously. We do need to work for transparency, moderation in naval development in this area in order to encourage maritime cooperation. The warnings of the past are there. There is a potential that things could go seriously wrong. And that's what we need to take in order to provide something of a guide to best practice, if you like, in the 21st century, if maritime tensions are to be reduced and maritime cooperation significantly increased. Thank you very much for your attention.